Normally, I introduce Cesare Lombroso in the course of a lecture when I discuss semiotics and semiology. Semiotics is a discipline that deals with communication. It is part of a growing number of disciplines that investigates what communication is about and how communication is generated. Now, it's firmly established by now that communication is at the core, is the essence of existence. If you take biology and you break down complex organisms all the way to the simplest elementary elements, well, you will find that cells have to communicate with one another and with different cells in order to create an organism. You go into the cell and you will find that there are proteins, there are enzymes, and other, let's call them ingredients, that communicate among themselves with a certain language and then with other ingredients with a different language, all with this goal of creating a complex organism, which in itself could be seen as a message. Now, you take particle physics, something that is a great interest to me, in particular quantum mechanics, and you break down matter to its elementary level, elementary particles. You find that below atom you have electrons and nuclei, and below that you find what are called now elementary particles. And the way they interact with each other is dependent on communication and vice versa. Communication is dependent on their existence. So having said that, human communication, which is not simply verbal, but it can be gestural or otherwise, has been the object of attention forever by philosophers, scientists, and particularly in the last century, and I would say the second part of the last century in particular, there has been a boom in disciplines that analyze and that have been combining elements from each other. So semiotics is part of and takes from and gives to communication, theories of communication, linguistics, psycholinguistics, cognitive psychology, and sociology, anthropology, a lot of disciplines altogether that investigate the phenomenon of communication within, their major concern. Philosophy is clearly one of them, and so on. Now, the article that I assigned to you from the New York Times only came out about 2 weeks ago, and I made a last-minute decision to start a course with that particular article. And now I'm wondering whether that wasn't a mistake. It was a little too much and a little too fast without previous background and preparation. But, those are the chances that you take when you want to integrate modern messages and contemporary texts into something that should be stodgy and rigid as an academic lecture. Well, it is by pure coincidence that that article also mentioned Cesare Lombroso. Cesare Lombroso is an extremely important figure in the history of science. The way I noticed it was interpreted, and not for fault of their own, was that it sounded like some kind of propagandist, some kind of, racist raging from the sides. Somebody said he betrayed his own kind by establishing, you know what the content of the article was, and then we'll go into that. But in reality, that wasn't the case. Now, it is undoubtedly true that his theories had enormous negative consequences, not just for Italians, but for all people who did not look like Northern Europeans, basically, Aryans, if you want to use a loaded term. But Cesare Lombroso was a psychiatrist, enormously influential in his times because he devoted his attention to the criminal mind, so-called. He was literally the founder of the discipline of scientific criminology, with all the errors possibly imaginable. Now, what did he do? He looked at signs, signals. Before the introduction of a scientific method into the description of society or the human soul, so-called, people were relying on, let's call them metaphysical explanations. If someone was evil, it was because he, normally, was possessed by the devil, or something in the past of his previous lives for certain cultures, or because of the history of his family, turned him into an evil person. Or there were elements of belief that there was a sick mind at place. Lombroso was the first one to look at criminals, and in particular to look at signs, signals that would help psychologists, psychiatrists like him, and law enforcement, I guess, society at large, that would help them identify criminals and eventually take measures against them, protective measures against them. Before the introduction of the scientific method into what we call now the social studies disciplines, everything relied on dogma and belief. So criminals before this period were seen as morally degenerates. Something was sick in their soul, or they were seen as possessed by the devil, agents of evil. The devil had penetrated them and through them committed murders, committed atrocious crimes. So there was a notion of, let's say, almost genetic perversion, something that you could not really. Cesare Lombroso introduced, Cesare Lombroso, what did he do? He looked at signs. He was, as a psychiatrist, working in insane asylums for the criminally insane, and started looking at criminals to try to discern if there were signs that could be detected that could reveal a criminal intent, a criminal mind, so that society could defend itself from these individuals. Before the scientific method was introduced, criminals were normally associated with categories like moral turpitude, people who were rejects of, they had rejected God, that they hated God, and therefore revealed this perverse, immoral soul, or people who had been possessed by evil forces. They were seen as literally agents of the evil, conscious or unconscious. When Lombroso came onto the scene, he drew his principles, the principles of his theory, from Darwin. Everybody knows about, at least the name Darwin, the evolution of species, and if I say the evolution of species, the survival of, everybody knows the answer, the fittest. Darwin establishes for the first time in the history of Western thought the notion that the history of humanity is a linear path, and it goes from the state of primate, ape, animal, to the state of sentient human, what now we call Homo sapiens. It is the very first time that this concept is brought into the consciousness of the West. The notion and the idea is that there is a progress toward the better. Evolution means that the fittest is not necessarily what now we think about in terms of fit. So collectively, humanity is going in that direction. However, not everyone, not every group is evolving at the same rate and at the same speed. And within every group, there are individuals who have not evolved at the same rate and at the same speed. So slowly this notion comes into the Western world that there is a benchmark, that there is a level of attainment that more or less all humans should share. It is the well-cultivated, the properly mannered, the properly attired white person. Anything that falls short of that is considered to be a leftover or a not fully developed human. The potential has not been expressed yet. Or it is one of the many traits that still have not been shed entirely and completely by humans in their journey toward quote-unquote perfection, whatever that may be. So based on this principle, people like Lombroso observe the criminally insane, and he associates them with characteristics and traits of people who are not fully and completely human yet. If human is described, is defined as being this white person that has all these positive characteristics. So he looks at the signs, and he argues, and that's okay, that is probably where the mistakes arrive. And he argues that there are certain distinctive features in the face in particular, but also the rest of the body, that can tell whether a person is genetically yet imperfect, still imperfect. And he mentions large protruding lips, very thick eyebrows, and I don't remember the other ones in particular. Definitely they have hirsute bodies, very hairy bodies, long arms, what we now call the knuckle draggers. Now, he puts all the signs together and says that when people have these signs, well, they have the potential of being criminals. He's not saying that all of them are criminals, but they have a higher potential of being criminals, of having these undesirable traits that have not been discarded yet. Now, whether his observations were correct or not, it's irrelevant. What happened was that his theories were extremely important at the time when society went from blind faith in the metaphysical to a more scientific approach. So by whom are they picked up? By universities. They are picked up by the media, by the people who are influential and begin to communicate to a larger public. More and more people are now able to read in the world, particularly in the West, than even 50 years earlier. And we're talking about the beginning of the 1900s, the 20th century. And these ideas slowly percolate and they're simplified. They're simplified to the point where they're actually reversed. The polarity is reversed. The message is no longer that certain signs point to a potential individual criminal. It becomes that people who look like that are criminal. So rather than looking for the criminal among the population, you find a population that is already criminal vis-a-vis the ideal of the white Aryan people. And it's no longer applied by the mass understanding. It's no longer applied to individuals, but then it is applied to entire peoples, entire populations, entire, what used to call them at the time, races. The term scientific racism in those days was not negative. It was indeed a very positive development conceptually, because it enables people to categorize the mass of humanity according to what were thought to be scientific rules. So if you have slanted eyes and certain facial features and the color of your skin is of a certain tone, well, then you are racially you are a member of a certain race, which is separate from, then you list all the possible races that you can think of. This is when scientific racism comes into place, and it is regarded as a very, very positive development, because, and here it's a very important conceptual principle, what is called taxonomy. Taxonomy means categorization, placing things into different categories. It is an essential function of our minds. We think in taxonomical terms. Science is based on taxonomy. For instance, if you take the human body, you have muscles, nerves, involuntary muscles, bones, cartilages. All of those things, all of the parts of our body fit into different categories. Taxonomy means ordering. Again, from Greek, taxos. So the two powerful concepts that emerge from science in this period are thrown into the population at large, and they are, well, taken and reinterpreted based on the understanding that people could apply to them. Now, here we have then the scientific racism. Obviously, because the races are different and because people share certain physiognomical, the face, physiognomy, categories, there are certain signals, then those races are immediately associated with particular dispositions of the mind and the soul, if you want. The worst, obviously, and the most extreme application of this discipline, this racial scientific racism, was by the colonial powers in Africa, the colonial powers in what will become the United States of America. They wiped out entire generations, entire population genocide of Native Americans. And then, of course, later on, it reaches its extreme manifestation in the racist theories of the Nazi regime, whereby at the bottom of non-humans, categories, were Jews and blacks. Just a step above them were the Slavic people. The Slavic people were considered to be idiots, basically, not intelligent, morally irrelevant, and they were just good for labor. So when Hitler launched his attack on Poland in 1939 that started World War II, the goal was to subjugate the Slavic people and turn them into the slaves of the Third Reich. For Jews, there was a final solution. They had to be exterminated, like the Italians that you saw in the very first cartoon, and they came very close to achieving that result, and at least certainly for Eastern European Jews, unfortunately, the goal was reached. Well, and then gypsies also were condemned to the gas chambers by the Nazi regime, and with them homosexuals. Those were the three major categories that the Nazi wanted to wipe out from the face of the earth. Now you can see the logic. I'm sure that you can see the logic in that proposition.